I thought I would start off with a quotation from a man who is certainly an expert in something, George Bush. Now, I came across this, and not too many things that he says strike me in any way, but this did. Maybe strike. What's that?
You're getting lower.
I'm getting lower. That's because I was thinking of him. I'm getting more depressed by the second. But I'll do what I can. But he said this sometime during the 1988 campaign. And he said, in my view, there's no place in American public life for philosophies that divide Americans from one another on class lines and that excite conflict among them. So, yeah, I mean, that interested me because I thought, well, is it philosophies that divide people along class lines and excite conflict among them? I mean, that's always that's been said for a long time. It's not reality. It can't be reality. It can't be that that's the way the world is. It can't be that that's the way America is. No, it must be that some people are going around with philosophies that introduce this into people's minds, have to tell people that there is a class society here and that there is class conflict here. Well, I suppose it's possible to think it's philosophies. It's possible to ignore that reality if you were born yesterday, if you have no sense of history, or if you have the sense of history that you got from going to school and reading all the orthodox texts, or you get your sense of reality from the 7 o'clock news or from the press. It's possible, just possible, to ignore that. I found it hard to ignore that, even though I suppose I learned my history originally from those same orthodox texts. I went to school like most Americans went to school and learned what most Americans learned and what most Americans still learn about American history. And what they learn is mostly about something glorious, triumphant, the march of democracy. In fact, if you look at the titles of books, Legacy of Freedom. Somebody showed me a book that's used in high schools around the country. Legacy of Freedom, the American Pageant. And really, that's what the titles are all about. You don't see any titles like The Sad Story of American History. So there are all these books that talk about the march of democracy and the march of progress. And here's something from this book, The Legacy of Freedom, which is a book for young people who are going to school, and it's maybe one of their first serious history courses. And this book starts out with an introduction telling young people what they are going to learn in this history text. And it says, Legacy of Freedom will aid you in, there were about 4 authors to this. They took turns writing each word, and so that none of them would know what was finally being said, because if they were people of conscience, that would be the only way to have them write this. And Legacy of Freedom will aid you in understanding the economic growth and development of our country. The book presents the developments and benefits of our country's free enterprise economic system. You will read about the various ways that American business, industry, and agriculture have used scientific and technological advances to further the American free market system. That system allows businesses to generate profits while providing consumers with a variety of quality products from which to choose in the marketplace, thus enabling our people to enjoy a high standard of living. Well, in that same book, I mean, that's a good, fair, accurate introduction, isn't it, to the history of the United States and the American system. And obviously the people who are going around now saying, well, you see, look what's happened to Eastern Europe, look what's happened to these countries that took a different path, and now we've got to get them back on the path of free enterprise and the market system. And these people were brought up on this kind of textbook, or these people helped write this kind of textbook. But another thing, Legacy of Freedom will aid you in understanding our country's involvement in foreign affairs, including our role in international conflicts and in peaceful and cooperative efforts of many kinds in many places. I mean, they're certainly right about the many places, But it's not just on the level of history texts for students that this is done, that a certain kind of history is presented which exalts in our system, our superior system, and the wonders of it. Among the professionals, now you would think that, well, this maybe for high school kids, yes, but as historians get more sophisticated, as historians get up into the higher realms, as they go to graduate school, as they get PhDs, notice how my voice is becoming more reverent by the moment, as we go to meetings of the American Historical Association. Has anybody here ever been to a meeting of the American Historical Association? Yes, I do recognize you. No, I'm joking. Actually, I didn't expect even one person to have been there, and now I'm a little suspicious. So you know what I mean about meetings of the American Historical Association. But one of these meetings is addressed by a president of the American Historical Association, and you can't get higher in the summit of historical professionalism, right, than the president of the American Historical Association. And he was addressing his fellow historians and saying about history and how history should be taught and how history should be written. Too much self-criticism is weakening to a people. A great people's culture begins to decay when it commences to examine itself. We have been losing sight of our national purpose. Our military preparedness held back by insidious strikes for less work and more pay.
When was that?
Oh, this was, I should give the date so it's not fair, right?
Yes.
Yes. 1941. 1941. Yes, right. So you can sort of, almost understand it if you try hard. And in fact, it was, around the same time that the historian Samuel Eliot Morison, somebody at the summit of the profession, said that he thought that historians should not take sides. They should, well, you know the whole business. Be objective, present things, as he put it, simply explain the event exactly as it happened. I like the word simply, as if it's simple to explain exactly what happened. And then he says in the same essay, which is called The Faith of a Historian, he criticized those historians who expressed disillusionment with World War I, because there were a lot of people who expressed disillusionment with World War I, including historians. He says, historians, these people rendered the generation of youth which came to maturity around 1940 spiritually unprepared for the war they had to fight. Historians are the ones who should have pointed out that war does accomplish something, that war is better than servitude. So on the one hand he says, yeah, historians should be neutral. On the other hand, he says, history should prepare people, young people, for the benefits of war. Now, he wasn't saying all wars, right? He was talking in a particular historical period, but still, he certainly was indicating that historians have a job to do, and he knew what that job was. In the McCarthy period, in the 50s, which of course is not the only period in which we've had McCarthyism, it's just that happens to be a period in which we had a name to attach to the period. And so in that period when they were calling up people, a few historians got nervous about being called up before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and some of them appeared before the committee to assure the committee that they were not that kind of historian, the wrong kind of historian. The historian who examines us too carefully, who is too self-critical. One of these, Daniel Burstein, who later became Librarian of Congress, he appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he assured them that while he had been, connected with communists at one time, he was now okay. And he would, the way he would show how different he was now is the way he would teach history. And he would do it in two ways. First, by, as he put it, by participating in religious activities at the University of Chicago. Committee like that. And the second form of my opposition has been to attempt to discover and explain to students in my teaching and in my writing the unique virtues of American democracy. Anyway, all of this is simply to say that the idea of presenting the history of the United States as a long march of virtue is something that has dominated American culture and dominated the teaching of American history. And part of it has been that which the quote from Bush refers to. Part of this orthodox teaching has been the teaching that if there's class conflict, it can only be because some philosophers have stimulated it. If there's an understanding of class differences in the United States, is because people have spread the idea of class differences. Well, I read these same books, and as I say, and took those same courses and so on. But I suppose at a certain point in my life, I began to veer off in this peculiar direction in which I've been going ever since. And I suppose I guess this happens a lot. People get away from that acculturation, those texts, that inundation of ideas in the culture, and they begin to look very sharply at the reality around them, or to think very deeply about what they themselves are experiencing. And so I guess I had experiences in my life which made me begin to question what I had read in history books about war, about class conflict, about the race question, about lots of things. At the age of 18, instead of going to college, I went to work in the shipyard. I say instead of going to college as if I had a choice. I decided as a sociological experiment to work, yes. And so I spent 3 years working in the shipyard and experienced, well, that reality, as so many people do, simply the reality of work, the reality of industrial work, the reality of hard work, the reality of working in conditions of cold and heat and bad smells and boredom and work. Yeah. And then I enlisted in the Air Force, and I became a bombardier in the Air Force, and I flew bombing missions in World War II. I guess I should say which war I was in, so that people won't think it was the Spanish-American War. And I knocked around various jobs and worked in a warehouse and ditch digger and brewery worker, and then decided to do nice work, get myself a nice job, go to school, study history, which I did under the GI Bill. So by the time I began to study history in this sort of semi-professional way, that's going through the whole history, I already had a set of ideas, I already had a set of experiences, and I knew enough as I began to read the books that were given to me in undergraduate and graduate school, and saw that they weren't significantly different from the books I'd gotten in junior high school. You know, that I discovered that very often you get in graduate school the same viewpoint, only a little more flesh. I mean, what's the point of fleshing out a bad viewpoint? But that graduate school simply repeated the fundamental biases of junior high school on a more sophisticated level and with more complex language. And so in order to learn something about things that I thought were missing from my books, I had to go outside the classroom and I had to read things of my own. And I began with labor history because I just got interested in labor history. I'd been brought up in a working class community, and I'd been in a couple of unions, and I was interested that the things I began to read about on my own didn't appear in my books. I didn't see Big Bill Haywood in these texts. I didn't see the IWW. I didn't see Mother Jones. I didn't see Emma Goldman. The few quick flashes I think there were a few lines on the Pullman strike of 1894, you see. Nothing about the Ludlow Massacre, nothing about the Colorado Coal Strike of 1913, 1914, nothing about the Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912. I mean, nothing about the thousands of labor struggles that people in this country have engaged in, all through our history. From the earliest time, from the early 19th century, from the organization of the mill girls in Lowell, and the Lowell Factory Association, and the protests and the strikes, nothing about that. And so I had to read on my own very often. They were not the kind of things that people would assign in courses, but it gave me new viewpoints. I read Howard Fast's books, The Last Frontier, and realized it's possible to have a different viewpoint on the Indians than the one that came across in history courses, where you knew about Custer's last stand and about two other little things, and that was it. You weren't told that during the Civil War, the Great War for Freedom, one of the great massacres of Indians took place out in Colorado. I read Fast's novel on The American, about the Haymarket Affair. Again, there hadn't been anything on the Haymarket Affair all through graduate school. This was a revelation. This was exciting, an amazing event, one of those events that deeply affects the people who live through it and know about it. Later I learned that Emma Goldman, as a young girl factory worker in Rochester, New York, that she was propelled into a certain kind of political consciousness by the fact that the Haymarket Affair had just taken place, and that she learned of the execution of 4 anarchists who were arrested in the Haymarket Affair, although there was no evidence against them that they had done anything except the fact that they were anarchists. So I began to read on my own, to read Upton Sinclair, and to learn not only about the stockyards and the fact that the profit motive seemed to lead industrialists to put up with the most horrendous conditions and subject their workers to the most brutal of situations in order to make more money. Not only did I learn about that by reading Upton Sinclair, but learned about socialism, learned about the ideas of socialism. I read Marx. I'm sorry to say that. I mustn't say that. Marx is dead. Marxism is dead. Right? It's all gone. Well, I mean, that's what we're hearing, right? I began reading this in the papers recently. Since the Soviet Union has collapsed, Marx is dead. As if the Soviet Union represented Marx. As if any place in the world has yet represented Marx. So I moved the books, the Marx books on my shelf, from one place to another to keep the authorities guessing. But I read Marx, and Marx said that history is a history of class struggle, and everything I read in American history suggested that this was true. Today I was on this radio program, this NPR radio program about history, and the guy who was my host, the host of the program, whatever, said something about, well, there are these 2 schools of thought about history, and one of them, that history is just this placid running on of events, and then there's the Marxian thought that history is a history of struggle. So, you mean only Marx? If you think that history consists of struggle, that you must be a Marxist? What about James Madison, who said that society consists of factions based on property? And Madison was saying this, well, when Madison, in the 1780s, Marx was not born. You might say, no, we're not Marxists, we're Madisonians. Swear, are you now or have you ever been a Madisonian? Well, I read Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, and learned, thought about and connected that with what I had learned about the populist movement and the plight of farmers all through American history, and farm workers, and farmers without land, farmers who are wage laborers, farmers who come from other countries and are exploited. So I read outside the classroom, and more and more sort of developed ideas about what was missing from history, and then I began to do my own research, since I was now a so-called professional historian, and I was supposed to do things like that. And, well, I had been interested in the Ludlow Massacre, that which was, as I say, missing from my textbooks. How many people here have heard of the Ludlow Massacre? How many people here have not heard of the Ludlow Massacre? Yeah. And there are a number of people here who have neither heard nor not heard of the Ludlow Massacre. It's like abstain. But I mean, those of you who know about it know that it is a remarkably dramatic and important event in American, not just American labor history, in American history. A strike of miners against, in 1913, 1914 in southern Colorado against the Rockefeller coal mines, and long, bitter, violent, dramatic strike, the kind of event which Hollywood would make a movie of if, one, it had any intelligence, and two, if it had that kind of commitment, and three, if it would be allowed to, you see. But it was an incident like so many incidents which, in a nutshell, bring together all the strands of a society and show you the role of the state, the role of the press, the existence of class conflict, the way the employer tries to divide workers from one another, because working in the mines were people of all nationalities, and Mexicans and Scotsmen and Bulgarians and Greeks and blacks, but who came together in this way, came together in this remarkable way. And the connections between the political power and economic power, the buying off of the National Guard by John D. Rockefeller, and the final attack by the National Guard on the miners' tent colony, and the burning of their tents, and the deaths of these 11 children and 2 women in the fire that engulfed these tents, which came to be known as the Ludlow Massacre, about which Woody Guthrie wrote a remarkable song, which some of you might have heard. I worked for a while on the congressional career of Fiorello LaGuardia, and who was before he was a mayor and before he was an airfield. Sometimes I say, well, LaGuardia, and people say, oh yes, the airfield. Yes. It's dangerous to have an airfield named after you. People forget you and remember the airfield. But before he was an airfield, he was the mayor of New York. Before he was the mayor of New York, he was a congressman from East Harlem in the 1920s. And I read, and I was interested in the 1920s. Well, 1920s was the jazz age, the age of prosperity. It was a great time. As I had, that's what the history books said. They still say that. Because, if you take those periods which they call depression, and then take those periods which are a little better than them, those periods look like prosperity. And so this was an age of prosperity. It was interesting to me to read the letters that LaGuardia received. By the way, he was a radical congressman. I say that very carefully. I mean, how often do you have a radical congressman?
We have one here.
What's that?
We have one here.
Have one here?
Yeah.
Ron Dellums?
Yeah. Well, not exactly here, but
Not close. Yeah. Well, that's close enough. Well, we'll take him. Anyway, LaGuardia was a radical congressman. He ran 1 year on both the Republican and the Socialist tickets. But he protested the sending of Marines to Nicaragua by Calvin Coolidge. People thought Calvin Coolidge never did anything. It's not true. He sent the Marines to Nicaragua. LaGuardia protested against this, but more than that, LaGuardia protested against what the working people in his district were going through in this age of prosperity. And if you read the letters that the people in his district were sending to him in the Jazz Age, the letters were full of, I can't feed my family, I can't feed my children, I can't pay for the doctor, I can't pay to have gas for cooking, my husband is out of work. And when I looked into this and I saw all around the country there were these great pockets of poverty and desperation in this age of prosperity. And one of the things it taught me, aside from teaching me that you have to be very careful about characterizing the state of a nation by the state of its upper class, the state of the economy by the stock market, as people today judge the state of the economy by the Dow Jones average. It's amazing to me, no matter what the news is, however the news changes from day to day, one thing you can always be sure of, they can tell you what the Dow Jones average is. And it's as if, this will tell you whether we are okay or not okay, well off or not well off. And they don't tell you what the unemployment figures are. They don't tell you what the infant mortality rate is today. They don't tell you how many people died in emergency wards today. No, they tell you what the Dow Jones average is today, and they infect the whole population with the notion that the measure of prosperity in the United States is the Dow Jones average. I began to think about that at that time. I also began to think about the labels of periods, the Jazz Age. And then I took a look at the Progressive period. Those of you who have studied American history, there's always a period called the Progressive era. Well, I thought actually it was sort of dangerous for them to say that, because it suggested that the other eras were not progressive. You don't want people to think that. But the Progressive era was the early years of the 20th century. Why was it called the Progressive era? Well, the textbooks made it clear. It was a time, those first 15, 16, 20 years of the 20th century, time when certain reform laws were passed by Congress, and and the amendments, the income 16th, 17th, the income tax amendment, popular election of senators, the Federal Trade Commission set up, the Federal Reserve Board set up, hours of railroad workers regulated, the Meat Inspection Act. Notice how good our meat is these days. The Meat Inspection Act. So it's the age of prosperity. It's a progressive era, the progressive era. And then I learned, that this, when I began to do more work in black history, I guess some of this came out of the fact that my first real teaching job, I had a few unreal teaching jobs. My first real teaching job was in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia. I taught in a black women's college in Atlanta called Spelman College. And you know Spelman College? Yeah. You heard of it? That's good. I was there during the years of the civil rights movement and got involved in the movement at that time. And I looked around and I saw that in this Negro college, as it was called at that time, in this women's Negro college, there was no course on Negro history. There was a required course, a required one-year course in the history of England. Really? Yeah. But it tells you, the how the culture dominates even the people who are have the least reason to accept this, but you go to college and these are the courses. I became interested in doing more and more in black history, and one sort of simple thing I learned was that in the progressive era, in exactly those years called the progressive era, those were the years in which the largest number of black people were lynched in the South and also in the North. Thousands and thousands of black people executed with the state governments looking on, and this should be noted, with the federal government looking on. This very often ignored the fact, thought as well as sure this happened in the South. The federal government is complicit in all this. Because the federal government, ever since the Civil War, had the right to interfere with this and didn't. Had a legal right, constitutional responsibility to stop this and did not, you see. So I became suspicious of labels of eras and names that are given to deflect people from understanding situations, Operation Rolling Thunder. And if you remember that, during the Vietnam War, that was what our intense bombing of Vietnam was called, Operation Rolling Thunder. Just a natural phenomenon.
Like Desert Storm.
Like Desert Storm is another natural phenomenon. Right. So it became clear to me the more I read and the more history I read on my own that no, it isn't philosophies that cause people to think that there is a class system in the United States. There is a reality of class from the very beginning of American history. If you go right all the way back to the colonial period, you find they weren't all founding fathers. They weren't all founding fathers and a few sons of liberty. At the time of the American Revolution, 1/5 of the population, 20% of the population, consisted of black slaves who were the heart of the agricultural working class of the Revolutionary period. Half of the people who came to these shores in the 17th and 18th centuries up to the American Revolution came as servants. And very few of them moved up into the middle or upper classes. Most of them, even when they got out of the position of being a servant, which was almost like being a slave, but of course not quite, they moved into positions of being laborers or workers or landless farmers. Some of them small farmers, but they didn't move up very far. This was a class society right from the beginning, where a few people started out with enormous quantities of land. They hadn't worked for it. They didn't gain it from their hard sweat, but as people say, well, maybe I didn't earn this enormous sum of money that I have, but my grandfather did. Well, if you trace the grandfathers back and back and back, you'll see, no, people didn't start off even, and then those people with great talent and great energy and great initiative and so on became multimillionaires. It didn't happen that way. No, it started off with a few people being given huge grants of land, millions of acres of land given away, 1/6 of New York State given away to one man by the governor of New York, who was a friend, a friendly act. It was a class society in the colonial period. And then there were uprisings and rebellions, not just slave rebellions, which there were, 6 major slave uprisings in the colonial and revolutionary period, but 18 major uprisings against state governments. The American Revolution was not a revolution of a united community rising patriotically against England. The American Revolution was the revolution of a society torn by class conflict, of rich and poor, of poor people suspicious of the founding fathers, suspicious of the leaders of the revolution, deserting from the army, refusing to fight, having to be cajoled, having to be threatened, needing George Washington to send Nathanael Greene down into the South with orders to kill some future soldiers as examples to induce the rest of them to join the Continental Army. It was a society ridden with conflict between rich and poor. When they announced the conscription of people for the American Revolution in Boston, the arrangement was that the rich could pay their way out of this conscription. A lot of people know that this took place in the Civil War. It also took place on the state level, on the colonial, in the Revolutionary War. And there was a protest demonstration in Boston against this. There were the Revolution, the war against England, put a blanket over the visibility of that class conflict, as wars do, and as wars very often are intended to do. You find, if you look at the history of wars, that wars seem to take place at a time when it might be dangerous not to have a war. Or as George Orwell said, he said, wars are fundamentally internal policies. Wars are fought in order to control the population at home. So the reality was class conflict in the colonial and revolutionary period. The reality of the Constitution was that it was an elite class that got together and in Philadelphia and formed the Constitution. And that class conflict continued all through the 19th century. And that march of industrial progress that took place after the Civil War, because I remember when I going to school and learning how this was the great heyday of the American economic system. That period between the Civil War and World War I was a period in which the United States became a great industrial power. It was a period in which, and the heroes were Rockefeller and Morgan and Carnegie and Mellon, the captains of industry. And they built up our country, and the railroads spanned the continent, and the oil refineries grew. And so it was a wonderful story. A story of enormous success. And what was left out of that story was the human cost of that industrialization. It's interesting to me that I can imagine somebody in Russia was talking about the Stalin period, saying that's the period in which Russia became a great industrial power. True, but that's what history is, partial truths, and that's not enough. Yes, it's true, but what about the human cost of that industrial development? It's easy for us to see it in relation to the Soviet Union. It's always easy for us to see things somewhere else. Harder for us to see it here. Harder for us to see that this magnificent economic system, well, the word magnificent, of course, is based on the Dow Jones average. That this magnificent economic system was created at enormous human cost and continues to exist at enormous human cost. That the Transcontinental Railroad was not this romantic meeting of these. I remember the movie was made called Union Pacific. Any of you remember that? You saw it. Yeah, do you remember what a nice movie it was? Well, we won't talk about that. But it was there was the Central Pacific, and there was the Union Pacific, and it was very exciting. And there was a man, and there was a woman. This is how Hollywood does things, right? There's this and that, and he and she, and they all come together at the same time, you see. And the golden spike is driven in, right? They didn't mean that. But I remember learning, I'm learning in junior high school what a great day it was. Oh, thank you. A golden spike was driven, and so it was a great achievement. And I remember learning that in school and feeling great pride about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it was only years later that I learned, and when you learn these things, you always feel stupid, because you think, now surely I should have figured that out before, right? I should have asked a question about that. I shouldn't have just let that slide. To learn, who worked on that railroad, who died working on that railroad, the thousands of Chinese laborers and Irish laborers who worked on that railroad, who worked themselves to death, who were worked to death on that railroad, who worked long, long hours in bitter, bitter cold, who got sick and who died, and who were just thrown away ruthlessly by the railroads, and more immigrants brought in to work on the railroads. That was behind the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And nothing in the books about who worked in those steel mills and under what conditions they worked, and how many died working in those steel mills. Those are very dangerous jobs, working in steel mills, working in foundries, working on the railroads. At the time that J.P. Morgan announced the consolidation of railroads in the United States, he was a great consolidator. 2,000 people were dying every year in accidents on the railroad. Industrial accidents in this country have exceeded the deaths in war. But you don't see that as part of the story. In the year 1914, 1 year, 35,000 people were killed on the job, and hundreds of thousands injured on the job. There's a human toll of injury and suffering and pain, of lost limbs, of lost fingers, of lost legs, of people crushed in industrial work. That's part of the cost of this great economic progress that we've been through. And the point of this is not simply to correct the historical record, although not simply to, as Morrison suggested, just tell the facts as they are. But the importance of this is that it's all suggestive about something today. It's suggestive about the fact that we have to look twice at 3 times at progress, at what is called progress, at technological progress, at going to the moon, at building spaceships, at anything that's presented as, well, this is a wonderful thing because it's advancing science, or nuclear reactors, nuclear energy, and so on. It's wonderful, wonderful things. Chemicals, plastics. How lucky we are to have plastics. How did people live before there were plastics? But the issues that are raised by a reconsideration of industrial progress and human cost in the 19th century are really the same issues that exist today when you consider the economy. The economy has to be seen in class terms. They do not want us to see the United States in class terms. When Bush said that, and that was a very serious statement by Bush, and of course Dukakis, whom he was accusing, I thought, what, Dukakis is arousing class conflict? I looked upon Dukakis in a new, fresh way. I'm sure he was surprised. And if he had ever even hinted in any of his statements that there was something like a class system in the United States, and I doubt that he did, I'm sure he immediately retracted the statement. You see. But there's the lessons of history, the story of class struggle and class division in American history is something that is extremely important if we are to look perceptively, look understandably, look meaningfully at the kinds of things that are being discussed today, where the attempt is, as always, to present the nation, one community, one family, the Constitution, the preamble, we the people of the United States, as if we the people of the United States created the Constitution and not 55 rich white men, no Indians, no blacks, no women. We the people of the United States, it's all one big happy family. I mean, that's what war is about. War is a wonderful way of covering up all the differences. We're all in this together. Right, Exxon and us. We have a common interest. I mean, that's what patriotism is, the creation of a common interest, the artificial creation of a common interest. And so the language that suffuses politics is devoid of class content. So they talk about taxation, they talk about spending, without any notion, without any suggestion that there's a class element to this. And so they'll talk about, well, the liberals want to tax and spend. Then the liberals get excited. Liberals are very excitable people and sensitive people. And say, no, we're not for taxing any more than you are. We're not for spending any more than you are. We're not for peace any more than you are. We're not for anything any more than you are, except winning the election, which we are for more than you are, you see. But I haven't seen any candidate, anybody running, saying taxation is a class issue. Yes, let's tax. Let's not be afraid to talk about taxation. Yes, we need to tax. Not the poor, not the middle class. Tax the rich. Tax the super rich. Tax the corporations, The corporations in the United States pay an average tax of 15%. Some of them pay 5%. Some of them pay 0%. You have a good enough accountant, you can pay 0%, you see. In Japan, they tax the corporations 40%. Notice how that has hurt their economy terribly. And you notice how, since Reagan lowered the tax rate on the rich and corporations, how our economy has boomed, you see. But even a small surtax on the super rich of 5% would generate $60-70 billion. 10% surtax would generate $140-150 billion a year. But that's only the beginning. It is possible by just taxation, and without reducing everybody to the same level. We mustn't do that, right? And people, as soon as you want to tax as soon as you want to tax the multimillionaires, you're accused of wanting to bring everybody down to the same level, you see. But how about halfway down? But taxation is looked upon, without any consideration of who you're taxing. Spend, again, we don't want to be caught spending. Why not? Why not spend? But there again, it's a question of what are you spending for? And who are you benefiting by your spending? Are you spending to bail out the banks? Are you spending to bail out the insurance companies? Are you spending to make sure that the people who have deposits of over $100,000 are taken care of? Are you spending to keep Chrysler in business? Are you spending, in other words, the way the government has always been spending? And that is to help help the richest elements of the society. Right? We've always had a welfare state. Before they talked about it as a welfare state, we started from the very beginning of this country giving welfare to the rich, to the bankers, to the merchants, with tariffs, with partnerships and banking between the United States and the National Bank, with subsidies and subsidies and subsidies. It was a subsidy here in San Francisco given to the maritime industry, which is one of the causes of indignation among the maritime workers here, and led to the great San Francisco strike of 1934 and the general strike of 1934 in San Francisco, as the marine workers, the sailors, the longshoremen, the dock workers became aware of the conditions they were living under and the fact that the government was giving money to the industry and had been for some time. So to look upon these things in class terms, look upon taxation, spending, the welfare state. If you talk about taxation in class terms and talk about spending in class terms and say what you're going to spend for and say you're going to spend to take care of people, you're going to spend, take that money that we are getting out of taxing the super rich and the corporations, and take the money that is being spent for these absurd weapons, hundreds of billions of dollars for that, then we could spend the money to have a free healthcare system for everybody and free housing for everybody who needs it, and no problem of food for anybody who needs food, no problem of the basic necessities of life for people who need them, no problem of guaranteeing jobs for people who need work, no problem of daycare in families where daycare is needed, none of that. So I'm suggesting that the history, the hidden history of class, of labor and capital, if you don't mind me using words like that, you see, but the hidden history of that in this country, the history that George Bush and all of his club members, want to obliterate, is exactly the kind of history, which we should reconstruct and remember, and bring forward. Thanks.